obviously.
Apparently the volcanoes on our world haven't received the Save the Planet BS.
Yes, climate change denying dipshits are well represented in the comments lately, and I'm always impressed by this intersection of low IQ, confirmation bias, cognitive dissonance, and the Dunning-Kruger effect. It's actually very hard work sustaining the fictional belief that it's all just a big conspiracy. Volcanic eruptions are a natural process, let's not forget, and also a comparatively small contributor to greenhouse. According to Scientific American and the US Geological Survey, the world's volcanoes, both on land and undersea, generate about 200 million tonnes of carbon dioxide annually, while our automotive and industrial activities cause some 24 billion tonnes of CO2 emissions every year worldwide. Despite the arguments to the contrary, the facts speak for themselves. Greenhouse gas emissions from volcanoes comprise less than 1% of those generated by today's human endeavours. You know, it takes only a couple of minutes to figure this out if you have the internet and a smartphone, which, let's not forget, are both powered by exactly the same scientific method, which is used by climate scientists. How much greenhouse gas do our bushfires emit? Who cares what our cars emit? And there are always volcanoes trying to outdo each other. Volcanoes, right? Previously asked and answered. Anyone using volcanoes in a climate argument is self-evidently a Muppet who has done no research. The point about bushfires, all right? Trees grow up, they die, they fall over, they burn, they grow back. The bush is renewable. But when you burn coal, which is Australia's biggest climate disgrace, that's kind of forever. Now, surely even the dumbest of dumb shit climate change deniers is going to struggle with this. Energy security is a real problem for Australia, and it's kind of a big deal because we are wholly dependent on the fragile supply chain of liquid fuels. We need them for our society to function at every level. And every time that retardistani orangutan in chief has an almost war with a nutbag regime like Iran, that chain gets more fragile. The price of oil jumps and things rapidly go downhill after that, potentially. Exactly the same precautions that we need to take to mitigate climate change would maximise our national energy security. And this is something the climate deniers conveniently overlook in their zeal to prosecute their bullshit argument.
Can a person pinpoint the exact moment they went from troll to politician?
Yeah, I certainly can. It was January of 2020 when our dipshit Prime Minister demonstrated how ill-equipped he and the federal and state governments are at crisis management. And I'd suggest to you that they are self-evidently fucking useless. We've got the Prime Minister doing the Guantanamo handshake after returning from his bold escape to Hawaii. He's doing that as a photo op with constituents who are clearly traumatised and hate him. We've got ministers disgracefully, fucking off on holiday in the midst of these crises like emergency services and strip-searching children ministers. And, icing on the cake, glacé cherry on top, we are also running out of drinking water. Melinda Pavey, that dipshit water minister in New South Wales. Now, if you're not from around here, the dams here are running dry. She says, let's not desalinate an ocean and have endless water to do whatever with. Just take 4-minute showers instead and it'll all be okay. And remember, putting your jeans in the freezer overnight is the same as washing them. I'm not making that up. I could not make that up and look at myself in the mirror and say, yeah, you know what, someone's going to believe that. But it is nonetheless true. That is official advice from Shitsville Water, widely reported in the media. Just have a look for it on Google. So, do me a favour, my jeans washing, freezing friend. Don't bother taking them off. If you're going to clean your jeans in the freezer, just jump in there with them. Just saying.
The IPCC tell us we've got fewer than 12 years to completely transform the way our global civilization operates if we're to stand any chance of avoiding the catastrophic social, environmental and existential consequences of runaway atmospheric warming. We're told we need to reach a net carbon zero position somewhere between 2040 and 2050, which means rapidly eliminating the use of fossil fuels, moving predominantly towards renewable energies, changing the way we build our homes, towns, cities and transport infrastructure, and transforming the way we feed ourselves. So how are we doing? Well, according to the International Energy Agency, global energy consumption in 2018 increased at nearly twice the average rate of growth since 2010. Oil demand rose by 1.3%, led by the United States. Natural gas consumption grew by 4.6%, its largest growth since 2010, again led by the USA, but followed closely by China. And overall global energy-related CO2 emissions didn't reduce. They actually went up by another 1.7% to an historic high of 33.1 gigatons. It's just not going to happen, is it? But what if we've been looking in the wrong direction for the radical short-term solution that we apparently so desperately need? What if we've been just a little bit too preoccupied with the second most powerful greenhouse gas in our atmosphere and forgotten to consider the most powerful greenhouse gas? What if the answer actually lies in water? Hello and welcome to Just Have a Think. Back in 1978, the then US President Jimmy Carter asked the Scripps Institute to advise him on the causes of and solutions to the global warming issue that was by then already becoming very difficult to ignore. Water vapour is by far the most powerful greenhouse gas in our atmosphere. There's about 100 times more of it up there than there is CO2, and it's about 7 or 8 times more effective at capturing the heat that leaves the surface of our planet. But in their response to President Carter, the Scripps Institute factored out water vapour and placed all their advisory emphasis on the CO2 concentrations in our atmosphere. Why? Because they knew that human beings were responsible for the rise in CO2 concentrations since pre-industrial times, and that it was mainly this rise that was causing the increase in temperatures. They also knew that it was still within the ability and control of human beings to bring about the necessary reductions in CO2 concentrations as long as the social and political will was there. By contrast, they stated 2 main reasons why they felt there was little point in trying to predict or control the effects of water vapour on our warming climate. Firstly, they said that water is such an overwhelmingly dominant force in our global climate systems that it was inconceivable that human beings could possibly have made any significant impact on its mechanisms and influence. And secondly, they concluded that the movement of water around our planet and the consequent effects of that movement were so hugely variable in both time and physical space that it was practically impossible to create any predictive mathematical modelling that would be of any help anyway. So our global leaders made the perfectly rational and pragmatic decision to control what they could control, and the focus was placed squarely on carbon dioxide reductions. Unfortunately, despite that apparent focus, our collective efforts at reducing our carbon dioxide emissions in the 40 years since that report came out have amounted to nothing short of a catastrophic failure. More recently though, there's been a growing realisation that we humans do in fact have at least some ability to affect the way that water and water vapour influence our planet's climate. This guy is Walter Jenner. Walter is an Australian climate scientist and soil microbiologist and director of Healthy Soils Australia. His research over many years has brought him to the firm conclusion that our only hope of short-term climate mitigation is to fundamentally change the way we manage our land, which in turn will bring about a radical transformation in the levels of water and carbon that our soils are able to retain. In April 2018, Walter delivered a lecture at Harvard University on what he calls the soil carbon sponge, and I'll leave a link to the video of that lecture in the description box below. It's a fascinating presentation based on the principles of something called regenerative agriculture. I highly recommend you go and have a look at it, but it is 2 hours and 9 minutes long, which probably means that not everyone will find the time to watch the whole thing. So in this 2-part video, we're going to offer a potted version of the science that Walter takes us through in his presentation. So grab a drink, settle in, and let's get into it. About 420 million years ago, our planet consisted of water in the oceans, containing the first rudimentary life forms, and dry land in the form of rock that had no life on it at all. But those rocks did contain essential nutrients like phosphorus, calcium, zinc and magnesium. The rock was made up of particles that were densely packed together, and if water hit the surface of those rocks, it would simply run off. But as it did so, it would leach out tiny amounts of nutrients. And life in the oceans relied on the leaching of these nutrients for them to use to drive their various basic life processes. As always, competition for food drove evolution, so any life form that could solubilize the nutrients out of the rock instead of waiting for them to arrive in the water found that they had a significant competitive advantage. The first life form to manage this was called cytoplasm, which together with enzymes formed into long tubes that we know as fungi. But fungi didn't get far on their own because they can't generate their own energy. Only plants can do that using the quite miraculous process that we call photosynthesis. Plant life in the oceans took the form of blue-green algae. So over evolutionary timescales, the fungi and the blue-green algae combined in a symbiotic relationship to form what we call lichens. And without any competition on the land, the lichens were able to spread rampantly. As the lichens solubilized the rock particles got moved apart, leaving air gaps. And as lichens grew and moved on, they left behind organic detritus, which filled the gaps between the particles and acted like tiny little bed springs. That detritus could also hold water, and so over time, through a process called pedogenesis, the rock was transformed into an absorbent spongy material, about 2/3 of which was just thin air. This stuff had a far greater surface area available for nutrients, and the air gaps meant roots could travel far further down below the earth. And that material is of course what we now call soil. Within about 100 million years, the planet was in a period known as the Carboniferous Permian, with lush forests teeming with life. And once our planet had soil, all the elements were in place to produce an evolutionary explosion in plant life, from lichens to mosses to ferns, through to the seed plants like cycads, gymnosperms, angiosperms, and eventually, about 50 million years ago, along came the grasses. Carbon was being drawn out of the atmosphere by the plants and fixed in the soil by the fungi, using sugars that they got from the plants in exchange for the carbon. And so the symbiosis continued. So much carbon was drawn down into the soil that the atmospheric concentrations of CO2 went from a starting point of about 8,000 parts per million to only about 100 parts per million towards the end of the period. And evolving alongside all of that were the insects and the herbivores. Fast forward a few hundred million years to our current predicament. This is a chart called the Keeling curve. It shows atmospheric CO2 concentrations based on observational readings taken at Mauna Loa in Hawaii since 1958. There's a seasonal pattern that you can see. The planet gives off CO2 in the winter and draws it back down again during the summer, predominantly driven by the northern hemisphere, simply because that's where most of the ice-free land is located. Every year, plants draw down 120 billion tonnes of carbon into their biosystems. Trouble is, every year the Earth re-emits 130 billion tonnes of carbon back up into the atmosphere. So we've got a deficit of 10 billion tonnes every year, and that's what's causing the graph to go up. We also know that the amount of energy reaching the top of our troposphere from the sun, something scientists call incident solar radiation, averages 342 watts per square metre. That's the energy coming into our planetary system. Simple logic says that if we want that planetary system to remain at a constant temperature, then we need to find a way of radiating the same 342 watts per square metre back out into space. The trouble is that the increase in greenhouse gases means we're only actually getting rid of 339 watts per square metre. So there's 3 watts per square metre of warming going on all the time across the entire 510 million square metres of our planet's surface. And that's a lot of warming. That extra energy has already caused about 1 degree Celsius of planetary warming since pre-industrial times. And the greenhouse gases that are already up in the atmosphere will continue to absorb energy and heat our planet for a very long time. Right now there's as much as another degree or so of further warming locked in that we haven't seen yet because of the time lag of the process. And the more we continue to pump out excess carbon dioxide into our atmosphere, the higher the temperature we lock into our system. Our current trajectory is towards about 5 degrees Celsius of warming by 2100, and there are plenty of videos you can watch or books you can read to find out how bad that would be. Seriously, if you don't know how bad that would be, I strongly suggest you find out, especially if you've got children. So our challenge is not simply to remove the deficit of 10 billion tonnes of carbon per year, but actually to do far more than that in an effort to reverse the extra warming that we're currently locking in. That probably means removing more like 20 billion tonnes of carbon every year. It certainly doesn't look like we're going to achieve that in 12 years by cutting out fossil fuels, because despite the Herculean efforts of the renewable energy industries, we simply are not reducing our global fossil fuel use. In fact, as we saw earlier, we're actually increasing it. So what's Walter Jenner's master plan for achieving our short-term goal? Well, according to the United Nations Environment Programme, or UNEP, the surface area of our planet where plants can carry out the work of fixing carbon into the soil is only about half the size it was some 8 to 10,000 years ago. And that's not because that land is now covered in cities and human beings. That infrastructure actually only accounts for about 1% of the ice-free land surface. No, it's because in those 8 to 10,000 years, human agricultural and livestock management techniques have been so misguided and profligate that they've created 5 billion hectares of desert and wasteland out of once fertile soil. But Walter Jenner argues that all that land and all those biosystems can be regenerated simply by copying what nature did when life first got going outside of our oceans. In fact, he tells us it's as simple as ABC. Here's how he explains the theory. A is for agriculture. This is what humans can observe and easily manage above the soil. Humans dominate this process and manage it to maximise the crop yield. But this top bit is only 30% of the overall biomass of the system. There's another 30% of the biomass in the root system, and the final 30 to 40% is kicked out or exudated as sugars and amino acids, and these are critical to drive the microbial and fungal ecology that makes the springy detritus between the soil particles that we looked at earlier and keep the whole system spongy and absorbent. The fungi grow in long filaments called fungal hyphae, which create a huge surface area for nutrients to pass between the plants and the microbial life around the roots. Jenner tells us that in a healthy soil there can be 25,000 kilometres of fungal hyphae in a single cubic metre of soil, and that's twice the diameter of our planet. And that microbial ecology includes not just the fungi, but bacteria, protozoas, actinomycetes, nematodes, collembola, earthworms, and all the other creepy crawlies, all contributing to the constant cycling of nutrients around a healthy soil. There's reckoned to be about 10 times the weight of organic life in a healthy soil than the animals living and grazing above it. Our modern day profit-oriented farming practices focus solely on maximising the crop yield at all costs, and so we engage in what Walter Jenner describes as more-on techniques. The first of these is clearing and burning. Of the 8 billion hectares of primary forest that originally existed on Earth, human beings have cleared 6.3 billion hectares and only regenerated about 1.8 billion. So we're now left with only 3.5 billion hectares, and every year we're burning 10% of what's left, about 350 million hectares. And we also burn about 2 billion hectares of grassland, crop stubble and rangelands every year. The second more-on technique is cultivation. Cultivation exposes the soil to UV radiation, which kills microorganisms. And thirdly, we over-fertilise the land with nitrates. Every gram of excess nitrate oxidises 30 grams of carbon. We also irrigate the land, which restricts fungal growth and slows productivity. We traditionally keep land fallow for periods of time, ostensibly to help it recover, but in fact this is essentially a starvation regime for the microbes and fungi in the soils. No plant growth means no sugars, so the soil's ecosystem grinds to a halt. And last but by no means least, we add biocides, which basically kill everything in the soil. More than 40% of the net global value of agriculture is invested in these practices and inputs, and yet according to Walter Jenner, every single one of these practices results in more and more soil carbon being oxidised back into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. And as the carbon leaves the soil, the fungi have nothing left to trade with the plants, which means no more springy detritus between the soil particles, no more air gaps for root systems to travel easily through, and so the soil collapses back to useless, compacted, impervious material, and we humans are left with dust bowls and deserts. According to Walter, our future literally depends on the B-C ratio. In other words, how much carbon we burn or oxidise back to CO2, and how much carbon we fix into the soil to maintain healthy absorbent material for future growth. And in part 2 of this video, we'll look at how the regenerative agriculture practices that Walter Jenner talks about can manage this balance, and we'll discover some of the dividends that could potentially transform our planet's temperature and climate. See you in part 2. Welcome back to part 2 of our summary of a 2018 Harvard University lecture delivered by Australian microbiologist and climate scientist Walter Jenner. In part 1 we discovered how nature's evolutionary systems over hundreds of millions of years converted large parts of the surface of our rocky planet into a spongy absorbent substrate that we now call soil. That soil allowed plant life to proliferate all over our planet, and the photosynthesis of those plants drew vast quantities of carbon dioxide down from our planet's early atmosphere. We also discovered how deficiencies in our human agricultural processes have massively degraded that soil and released large amounts of carbon back up into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. And we also learnt that Walter Jenner is promoting an alternative system that he calls the soil carbon sponge, which he tells us is as simple as ABC, where A represents agriculture, B represents the burning of carbon, and C represents the fixing of carbon into our soils. According to Walter, our future literally depends on the B-C ratio. In other words, how much carbon we burn and oxidise back into CO2 in the atmosphere, and how much carbon we fix into the soil to maintain a healthy material for future growth. Fixing the carbon in the soil is key to the success of regenerative agriculture. Left alone, the roots and root exudates will convert into humates, which contain powerful natural acids that maximise the composting process and promote fungal growth. And we know from part 1 of this video that in a healthy soil there's 25,000 kilometres of fungal tentacles called hyphae in every cubic metre, helping to fix the carbon in and also to stabilise nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus in the soil. As the fungi move on, they leave behind something called glomalin. Humates and glomalin then combine together to effectively create the glue that aggregates the soil and creates the springy detritus between the soil particles, keeping the soil spongy and absorbent. So as usual, nature's already formulated a perfect strategy underground to fix the carbon and keep all those nutrients cycling around the system really fast. But what about the carbon content in the stubble and litter that gets left on top of the ground? Well, Walter Jenner argues that this is where ruminant animals play a crucial role. Jenner maintains that the grasslands that evolved 50 million years ago existed only as a result of a symbiotic relationship with herbivores. The herbivores got to eat the grass, and in doing so they broke up the surface soil, spread seeds around, and distributed their own brand of natural organic fertiliser on the land. Then they moved on and did the same thing somewhere else, allowing the grassland they left behind to benefit fully from their activity before the herd returned to that particular patch later in the season or perhaps even the following year. Without that interaction, Jenner argues, the grasslands would have turned quickly to desert and all the carbon stored in the soil would have been released back into the atmosphere as CO2. Regenerative agriculture mimics this symbiotic relationship by actively moving herds of animals from one area of land to another, allowing them to graze the grass, trample the ground, break up the surface and distribute their waste products before being moved on to the next zone. And this can be done several times a day. It's extremely labour intensive for the farmers, but they understand the benefits that the system brings. But hang on a minute, aren't we constantly being told that ruminant animals produce methane, and methane is a much more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, right? Well, of course the answer to that is yes. But Walter Jenner explains that in a healthy ecosystem like the ones that regenerative agriculture is recreating, nature's already got a balancing mechanism for that in place as well. Healthy green grassland produces water vapour through the process of transpiration. As sunlight hits water vapour, it photooxidizes it, and one of the products is hydroxyl ions. Hydroxyl ions are very aggressive and reactive, so when they come into contact with the methane gas produced by the ruminant animals, they break that methane down into CO2 and water. Jenner suggests that a healthy green pasture will produce about 100 times the hydroxyl ions needed to break down the methane that the herbivores grazing that land have the potential to produce. It's important to point out here that what Walter Jenner's talking about is completely different to the industrial mega farms that churn out animals for the beef industry in huge intensive dust bowls, feeding the livestock on starchy cereal crops like soy to maximise the bulk of the animal before slaughter, with the sole focus being optimisation of throughput and maximisation of profits, with no thought whatsoever to the sustainability of soil, environment or climate. The starchy food that those animals are forced to eat causes them to produce far higher levels of methane, and they don't graze healthy green pasture, so there's little transpiration to cancel this methane out. There are more than 1.4 billion cattle in the world today, the majority of which are farmed in this intensive way, producing methane that's equivalent to 2 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide every year, or 40% of the global methane budget. It's an industrial system that's completely unsustainable and rapidly destroying vast tracts of otherwise fertile land and forestry area. In stark contrast, there are significant dividends to be had from Walter Jenner's soil carbon sponge system and regenerative agriculture, not just for the landowner, but for the climate and environment as well. According to Jenner's data, the 1,000 or so Australian farmers currently participating in the Healthy Soil Australia programme are apparently achieving 100% of the crop yield, with 300% the quality and nutritional integrity of the food grains, with less than 20% of the inputs, less than 10% of the risk, 300% the reliability, and 500% the natural land, capital and soil regeneration value. And from a climate point of view, because the soil is healthy, spongy and wet, the process of transpiration effectively creates a heat cycle. Every gram of water leaving the soil through transpiration needs 590 calories of energy to change state from water to gas. That's just the basic physics of latent heat of vaporization. That energy comes from the surface of the soil, so the surface can only cool as a result. The vapor carries the energy up into the atmosphere, where it condenses back into micro droplets of water, releasing the heat energy to continue on into space. So heat is being constantly conveyed away from the surface of the Earth through this process. About 24% of the 342 watts per square metre of energy currently reaching Earth is taken back up into space by these latent heat fluxes, and that's about 85 watts per square metre. So Jenner argues that just a 5% increase in the global area of healthy green pasture would offset the 3 watts per square metre of deficit that we're currently experiencing. Eventually this water falls back to Earth as rain to replenish the soil, and the cycle of transpiration and condensation continues. But it takes 1 million microdroplets to form a single raindrop, and before that happens, the microdroplets form dense clouds. At any given time, about 50% of the surface of the Earth is covered in cloud, and the albedo effect of the white cloud surface reflects back into space about 120 watts per square metre of the 342 watts per square metre of energy that arrives in our atmosphere. So Jenner's suggesting that if the extra transpiration and condensation from the extra area of healthy green pasture produce just a 2% increase in global cloud cover, that'd offset another 3 watts per square metre of the incoming solar energy and potentially achieve the cooling effect that we require to reach our short-term climate mitigation goals. Land with healthy green plant and grass cover and daily transpiration processes has soil beneath it that typically rarely gets above 20 degrees Celsius. This is in contrast to bare, barren land that can have soil temperatures as high as 60 degrees Celsius. That's already a big difference in temperature, but Jenner points us to something called the Stefan-Boltzmann equation, which states that re-radiation from a black body like the Earth is proportional not just to the temperature, but to temperature to the power of 4. In other words, temperature times temperature times temperature times temperature. So the radiation from land at 60 degrees Celsius is massively higher than land at 20 degrees Celsius. Essentially, there are 3 main factors that cause the greenhouse effect. The first is how much re-radiation occurs in the first place. The second is how much of that re-radiation is absorbed by water vapour molecules. And the third is how much of that re-radiation is absorbed by carbon dioxide molecules. Walter Jenner maintains that all climate models completely ignore the first factor, the re-radiation, and re-radiation is governed largely by land management, and land management is dominated by human agricultural practices. And he reminds us that water vapour accounts for 90% of the overall greenhouse effect that naturally regulates the planet's temperature. So a relatively tiny change in this variable can bring about a relatively large change in that temperature. But he also makes the very important point that despite all its beneficial effects, regenerative agriculture shouldn't be seen as a reason to reduce the urgency with which we're pursuing a wholesale reduction in fossil fuels and all the other climate mitigation practices like renewable energy. We need to keep carbon dioxide out of our atmosphere and into our soils as much as we possibly can, says Jenner. And if we can succeed in doing that, then we're probably going to go a long way towards achieving our very urgent short-term climate mitigation goals. That's it for this two-parter. Please do give us a like and a share if you found the programme useful and informative, and you can really support the growth of the channel by subscribing and hitting the little bell icon so that you get notified of when the new programmes come out each week. Subscriptions and views are the lifeblood of all YouTube channels. It's how we get noticed by the YouTube search algorithms so that more and more people can hear the messages that we put out. It's completely free and dead easy to subscribe. All you need to do is click on that icon there. As always, thanks very much for watching. Have a great week and remember to just have a think. See you next week.